Well, my name is Jens Baudisch. I'm a sound designer for Milo Rau mostly. And I was born in East Germany and went for the US for half a year. Started studying computer science. And but I found out during my study in the US that that's not really what I liked. So I came back and I started to study media design. I applied, then I studied it at the Bauhaus University of Weimar. And after my study, I went for a year abroad to Australia, work and travel. And when I came back, I started looking for jobs, and I got hired by Milo's first international breakthrough piece, and that was that. I always liked music. I always had a thing for music. When I was younger, it was more like goth music, because that was a thing in East Germany after the fall of the wall for some weird reason. I don't know why. And I actually started, when I was studying computer science at the University of Magdeburg, I already started with some friends the university radio, and that was mainly covering journalistic work with or about music in this case, and in this case Gothic music. And well, that kind of set the path towards being interested in sounds and music in general even more. So when I went to the US, I did a course there for radio programming as well. And that was like the teacher was pretty cool. He owned a radio station, and that was also where I learned to edit with tape, and I'm kind of happy I was still able to learn that, because it was such a different feel of editing, because I started out with editing on the computer and it's shifting bytes back and forth, and with the tape it had like the haptic feel to it. That was really cool. And when I came back, I decided, okay, I want to do something with media, with sound. So I applied at the Bauhaus University for the back then new study media design, and they had actually a chair which was called experimental radio under Ralph Hohmann, and he was an artist, and he was, yeah, that was basically my main introduction into, because the study there was completely project based. Like, I was used to having classes that I had to go to, and you had a strict schedule to follow, and there it was more like, okay, the topic for this year's project is going to be rose is a rose is a rose. And then you start working on that topic to come up with something, and depending on what your strengths were, you could do video art or visual art or whatever. You could, I guess, even an experimental dance if you wanted to. But yeah, I've always liked the experimental radio, so I always worked there and did that. And what I mostly liked was actually doing DJ hours during the night when I didn't know if someone was listening or not, because we had like a real radio station, a small FM frequency, and that was pretty cool. No, I do not have any classical training, and I do not really play instruments. I really play with sounds mainly. I cannot play a melody at all, but for my field of work, I do not need that. I met Milo because a friend of mine who was also studied in Weimar, and he didn't want to do a theater project, and he asked me if I was interested, and I'm like, sure, what's it all about? And the piece was called Hate Radio. And when I met Milo, he explained to me the concept of the piece, and that was really cool, because it's a radio station in Rwanda in 1994 during the genocide, and it's the RTLM. And that was the main propaganda radio station for the Hutu who were killing the Tutsis in 1994, between 800,000 and 1.2 million, depending on which statistics you look at it. And it was basically trying to recreate a radio show during that time period. And I mean, yeah, that was because African radio stations, no offense, but they are wild and they don't have the same sense for acoustics than European listeners are used to. So if you, especially during that time, if you listen to these old recordings, they are always too loud and they are always way into the red, and you, like, for a European listener, you could not, it would not be possible to present this to a European audience. But what you can do still is you can give the voices a little bit of grain, and you definitely can go into the red from time to time because they have a very high dynamic range, and that gives it a little bit of dirtiness that kind of works in theater. But it's not the original, obviously, but it sort of is a trade-off that you kind of have to live with in that case. Otherwise, you would blow people's ears off. But the concept of the whole thing was you have the people having the radio show, and they were in a box. People could look from it from both sides, and everybody had a radio and headphones, and they would listen to the show on the radio. And that just was, to me, a really brilliant concept of, like, okay, we're doing a radio show, we're doing a radio show. And yeah, that was a very nice start. Well, we haven't played hate radio in Salzburg, but we have played it in Vienna, which is also a classical city, but in a rather, at the Black Box Theater, which is really nice. Right across from I think the Philharmonics are there, I'm not quite 100% sure, or the opera, I don't know exactly, but it was really fun because I actually had to check the radio transmitter. I had to tune down the power of the radio transmitter, so to make sure that we were not interfering with the frequencies over there for whatever reason, wireless microphones or something like that. That could happen, it should not, but nevertheless. But it was really cool because, well, it depends on the audience though. The audience usually is rather young. We did play some pieces of Milo, which are not so sound focused, but one called Dark Ages, and Laibach made the soundtrack for that. And well, Laibach is the Slovenian industrial pop group sort of thing. And there were mainly old people in the audience, and you could see that they didn't like it too much. It was like really, I don't know, it was not their style of theater, I guess. They were used to seeing a show sort of thing, but with Milo it's a lot of talking because his texts are very strong, and it's not, he doesn't put on a show because he's doing documentary theater. So there's always a grain of reality in it, and that probably, that does not appeal very much, I guess, to people who consider theater a classical environment and therefore should follow certain strict rules. And that's not what we're doing. For this interview, we had the first day of rehearsals today, and I basically created some soundscapes which were mostly atmospheric, so just, I don't know, some field recordings with the dog barking in the background and the churches, and like something that symbolizes the Alps, because it's about Osina, she's from Swiss, so that sort of are supposed to be the soundtrack of her youth in a certain way. And Milo had the crazy idea of that Osina is actually playing a tape, and then everybody is listening to the tape, and the sounds from the tape are also being transmitted in the big hall. There were first of all technical problems for that because, well, tape is a technology that's 40, 50 years old. So how the hell do you get that wireless mobile, because she's also carrying the tape around, onto the into the speakers of into the mixing desk of the theater. And second of all, I'm not very convinced that tape, because it's analog and it has this, I mean, the cool thing about tape is because it's analog, it always has errors in it, so it's never the same. That's a nice thing. But if you want to have a show where you can recreate the same atmosphere the whole time, I don't think that tape is necessarily a very good medium for that. So now we kind of settled on that the atmosphere in general is coming from the computer, and Osina is just supplying this from time to time with, I don't know, she puts on some winds or stuff like that. And yeah, and later on we will have some sounds as well, but we have not reached that point yet. Milo specified something like a spooky sound. So I make the spooky sound and I hope he finds it spooky. And then we will see. And that's supposed to be only, the sound for Milo is never in the foreground. Like, because he's doing so heavily text-based, partially documentary theater, its sound for him is always just a supporting role. It's just a supporting act. And yeah, that's basically the big, also the big challenge in a way, to do something that is not screaming for attention, but that it's there. And just like Brian Eno, Music for Airports, you should not necessarily absolutely notice the music, but you should notice it when it's not there. That's sort of the goal. Well, the main starting point is always a script. And with Milo, the script is constantly changing. But obviously, when you read the script, you think of, well, okay, I need that, I need that, I need that from a practical point of view. And then when it comes down to, okay, now we need to create an atmosphere, you definitely want to see what she's actually talking about. And then trying to imagine that, or come up with some pictures in your mind, and then you want to create a soundtrack for these pictures. At least that's how I roll with it. As for music in general, or if music should be important, I would think that depends very, very strongly on the piece and on the abstract intention of the piece, sort of. Like Milo is very, very text heavy. So the text is definitely the star. No questions about that. But well, if you go to a concert and people sing, or if you go to a, I don't know, straight edge concert where people just scream something and playing music very loudly, so that's a totally different concept of music, and I think it should always be adapted to what you want to achieve. Like, if you want to, we also have, the last piece was La Reprise, and there he's playing, one of the actresses singing to Klaus Nomi, who was a gay musician in the 80s, and a German one. And at the end of the piece, the actor basically is singing the opera of Klaus Nomi, because he was an opera singer and he made electronic music with opera influences. So it's quite an interesting mix. And there it's totally clear that everything in this whole piece builds up to this moment. So this needs to be nailed and absolutely perfect to a certain sense. And well, we had the music, the original music, and then he needs to hit every point, and I need to do a very good job at mixing it at this time, so that his voice is very present without being too loud, or too loud over the music. So this is it always kind of depends on what effect you want to create. And music can be supportive, but music can also be the star, even in Milo's pieces. I usually use recordings that I do myself or I find on the internet. You always have to ask for permission for that, of course, but after that, once you've done that, you think, okay, does that work with the script or not? And sometimes it really helps if you read the script loud out for yourself as well to get a sense of timing. Obviously, you will be always wrong because the actor or the actress is always has a different rhythm. But you're doing definitely that, and then you think, okay, this could work, or this is probably not going to work. And if this is not going to work, then you basically have to start fresh again. If you think this could work, then okay, I can go in with that and I can present that for the first rehearsals to see where we go from there. Because the rehearsal period is, at least for Milo, it's always highly dynamic. So to come in with something that is absolutely perfect, you do not do yourself a big favor in doing that, because most likely it will not end up the way you have created it. It will undergo changes and you will need to be flexible, and your ego should not hurt too much if he says, well, no, that's not going to work, I want something else. And then you go back to the drawing board and do that. And that's what I will actually have to do when this is over. Soundscapes, I'm not so familiar with classical music or old in experimental classical music. I do not know what kind of experimental classical musicians in the 17th, 18th century were around and famous. If there weren't any, I don't know. But I think the modern computer has actually, because you can, again, just like classical music is basically composed in your head. You write down the notes and you think about how that would sound, and then you create everything in your head. And you write down the notes and everything is like on the spot, usually. And I think the modern computer has sort of made this possible again, because during the rock era, there were just bands jamming around, they came up with some melodies and then they created songs, which are, no questions about that, sometimes absolutely awesome, but they were not structuring that or most of them were not structuring that in a specific mental way. They were like jam sessions and you would experiment and then you would get something out of it, which was great or not or whatever. And the computer, I think in this sense, has enabled again a very structured process of getting this result done. Because you start with an empty sketch and you have the BPMs now in the programs, and you can basically put everything to where it belongs, just like the classical composer in his head. You put everything down there, just have the advantage that you can immediately listen to the result and think, okay, that's going to work or that's not going to work. So I think computer technology has actually re-enabled sort of in a modern way the same way of composing music than the classic composers did. Well, I think the most memorable is definitely Hate Radio, because also we went to Rwanda and we performed it there, and it basically we found out that we couldn't use parts of what we were trying to use in Europe, and because it didn't make any sense to have it repeated in Rwanda, where the people were still having all these memories about the genocide. And so this is actually really good about my job, that I tend to travel a lot, and sometimes I accompany also the research trips, and that just gives you a very, very good perspective of the country, of the environment, what to look out for, what to care for. Like I said, with the radio stations in Africa that sound to our European ears horrible, I would not have found that out if I wouldn't have been there. So I think that's actually the best thing about the job, that you get the chance of getting to know cultures, learning cultures, and firsthand, basically. What I'm looking forward to is basically the 19th of August, when I'm sitting at the theater and I'm watching the piece for the very first time with other people in the audience and awaiting their reaction. That's what I'm looking for.